Morning they locked me out. I was carrying a gas station coffee and a folder I'd been working on since 4 a.m. I know the exact time because I couldn't sleep. Hadn't slept well in 3 weeks, actually, not since the acquisition talks started and I understood what was really at stake. I remember standing at the elevator bank on the ground floor of our Houston office, pressing the button for the 7th floor, watching the numbers drop. When the doors opened, the hallway looked the same as it always did. Gray carpet, fluorescent hum, the faint smell of the cleaning crew's lemon disinfectant. But my badge didn't work on the frosted glass door at the end. I tried it twice. Nothing. Just the flat red light and a small beep, the kind of sound a machine makes when it's decided something about you. I stood there for a moment with my coffee going cold. I want to tell the story slowly, because the details matter. Because when I look back now, I see how long it had been building and how completely they misunderstood what they were dealing with. I am a petroleum reservoir engineer. I have been one for 26 years. I spent the first 8 at a small independent firm in Midland, Texas, learning the work from a man named, I'll call him my old boss, who believed in doing things the hard way because the hard way was the only way that lasted. He made me run simulations by hand before he'd let me touch the software. He said if you don't understand what the machine is doing, you're just guessing at a prettier speed. That lesson stayed with me. I joined my second company, the one at the center of this story, when I was 31. I'll call it the company. It was a mid-sized independent oil and gas firm, not a major, not a wildcat, something in between. Around 200 employees at its peak. My father-in-law, who'd worked in the industry his whole life, told me when I took the job that mid-sized firms were where the real technical work happened, because they were big enough to matter and small enough to still need people who actually knew what they were doing. He was right. For about 19 years, he was exactly right. What I built there, over those years, was a reservoir modeling and production forecasting system. That's the plain description. The more honest description is this: I built the thing that told the company whether a well was worth drilling, how fast it would produce, how long it would last, and what the risk-adjusted return would be when the board needed a number to put in front of investors. Every significant capital decision the company made in the last 14 years went through my model first. I hadn't set out to build something proprietary. It started as a personal workflow, scripts I wrote for myself to stop doing repetitive calculations by hand. Then my colleague, I'll call him my former colleague, started using them. Then the operations team. Then it got formalized, put on the company server, integrated into our reporting structure. By the time anyone thought to ask whose work it actually was, it had become the spine of the company's technical operations. There was a clause in my original employment contract that addressed this. It was written in 2002 by the company's founder. I'll call him the founder, a geologist from Oklahoma who built the firm from scratch and believed, genuinely, that the people who created value should share in it. The clause stated that if I remained employed at the company in good standing until the completion of our Haverford Basin development project and received my contractual project completion bonus, the intellectual property rights to the modeling system would transfer jointly to me. The Haverford Basin project was the biggest thing we'd ever done. $480 million in committed capital, a partnership with the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, the kind of deal that gets written up in trade publications. It had taken 11 years to develop. My model had been the technical foundation of every phase. The bonus was $90,000. The founder retired 5 years ago. He sold his controlling stake to a private equity group, which brought in new management. I'll call the new CEO the CEO. He was 43, sharp in meetings, good at the language of deals. He promoted his son, who had an MBA and had never worked a day in the oil patch, to head of corporate development. The CEO's son and I had a civil relationship for about a year. Then it became clear to him that I did not defer to him, and the relationship changed. He wanted to run the Haverford final phase operations through a simplified workflow he'd seen at a conference. I told him the simplified workflow was designed for conventional reservoirs and ours was not conventional. He said I was being territorial. I said I was being accurate. He escalated to his father. His father called me into his office and told me to find a way to make it work with the new approach. I told him I could do that. I also told him if we did it that way, our production forecast for the first 2 years would be off by somewhere between 30 and 40%, and our Norwegian partners would have grounds to challenge our reserve certifications. He thanked me for the feedback and told me to proceed with the original methodology. That was 8 months before the end of the project. The PE firm had been running a quiet sale process for about a year by then. I knew this the way you know things in a company that size, not through official channels but through the texture of conversations, the consultants who kept appearing with badges from a firm I recognized, the way certain topics got changed when I walked into a room. A Houston-based major, one of the large integrated companies, was the most likely buyer. The deal being discussed was somewhere in the range of $400 million, structured around the company's proved reserves and its production technology. My model was explicitly listed in the data room as a core technical asset. I know because I helped prepare the technical documentation. I want to pause here and say something because I've thought about this a lot since. I wasn't sitting in my office planning anything. I wasn't plotting. I was doing my job. The same job I've been doing for 26 years, and I expected that when the project concluded and the bonus was paid, I would receive what my contract said I would receive. I would own, jointly with the company, the thing I had built. That had always been the arrangement. I had never had cause to think about it differently. The project completed on a Thursday in late February. We had our final production milestone, the technical deliverables were certified, and our Norwegian partners signed off on the reserve audit. I sent the documentation to the CEO's office the same afternoon. My bonus was due within 30 days. On the following Monday, the CEO's son called me into a conference room on the 6th floor. I noticed when I walked in that there was an HR representative I hadn't met before sitting to the side with a notepad. He told me the company was restructuring the technical operations team. He told me my position was being eliminated. He told me it was a business decision with no reflection on my performance. The HR representative handed me a packet. I asked when my effective termination date was. He said Friday of that week. I did the calculation in my head. The project had completed the previous Thursday. My bonus was contractually due within 30 days of project completion. My termination date was 9 days after project completion. I thanked him for his time. I took the packet. I walked back to my desk, drank the rest of my coffee, and started making a list. My attorney, I had used him for some real estate work years earlier, answered when I called from the parking garage. I read him the relevant section of my employment contract over the phone. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "Does the company have a current acquisition in process?" I told him what I knew. He said, "Don't sign anything they send you, and call me back in an hour." Here is what my attorney explained to me over the following 2 days, in plain language, after he'd reviewed the contract and the asset purchase documentation he subpoenaed through a preliminary injunction filing. The IP transfer clause in my contract was not conditioned only on my employment status. It was conditioned on the payment of the bonus. If I was employed in good standing at the time of project completion, which I was by any objective measure, and if the bonus was paid, the transfer occurred automatically. But there was a second provision, which the founder had included and which no one in current management had apparently read carefully. If my employment was terminated prior to bonus payment, and if that termination occurred within 90 days of project completion, the bonus obligation remained, and the IP transfer clock did not stop. The company could not eliminate the payment by eliminating me. Furthermore, the IP transfer, once triggered, was joint ownership, not a license, not a right to use, co-ownership of the underlying work. The acquiring company's technical due diligence team had reviewed the modeling system under the assumption that it was wholly owned by the company being acquired. Their purchase agreement reflected that assumption. My attorney filed a notice of claim the following Tuesday. I was sitting at home when I heard from my former colleague. He called me on my personal cell, which told me he wasn't calling from the office. He said there were a lot of panicked people on the 7th floor. The buyer's legal team had flagged the cloud and paused the closing process pending resolution of the IP ownership question. The deal was supposed to close in 18 days. He asked me what I was planning to do. I told him I was planning to receive what my contract said I was owed. He laughed a short, tired laugh. He said, "They're saying you're doing this out of spite." I said, "I built that system for 20 years. I am doing this because it is mine." There were 2 rounds of attempts to settle before we got to a formal mediation. The first was a phone call from the company's general counsel, who told me the termination had been a clerical error, that my position had never actually been eliminated, and that I was welcome to return to work with back pay for the 9 days. I asked whether the bonus would be paid in full and on schedule. She put me on hold for 4 minutes and came back and said yes, it would be paid, and additionally, would I consider a consulting arrangement at a higher rate going forward. I said I would consider everything in writing. The writing came 3 days later. The bonus was there. The consulting language was vague in ways that concerned me. My attorney flagged 2 provisions that would have effectively signed over any future improvements I made to the model, even independently back to the company. I declined. The second attempt was the CEO himself. He called me at home on a Sunday night. My wife answered. I could hear her from the other room, her voice going careful and neutral in the way it does when she recognizes a name she wasn't expecting. She brought me the phone without a word. The CEO told me he respected the work I had done. He told me he had been poorly advised about the operational changes his son had proposed. He acknowledged that my termination had been handled badly. And then he made me an offer. He said the acquiring company had agreed in principle to include a technology transfer fee in the deal structure. He said that fee, attributable to my contribution to the modeling system, had been valued at $9 million. He said that if I signed a clean release of any and all IP claims, that fee would be paid to me at closing. I told him I would discuss it with my attorney and call him back. My wife and I sat at the kitchen table until almost midnight. She is the kind of person who thinks before she speaks, and that night she spoke slowly. She said, "What do you actually want out of this? Not what are you entitled to. What do you want?" I thought about that for a long time. I said, I don't want them to be able to do this to the next person, and I want the thing I built to be acknowledged as mine. She nodded. She said she understood. My attorney walked me through the offer carefully. $9 million was real money. It was also a clean exit. Sign, take the check, go away. But there was something in the release language that I kept returning to. It wasn't just a release of the current claim. It would have prevented me from ever asserting in any future context that the modeling methodology was my work, not just the ownership, the authorship. The release would have, in effect, allowed the acquiring company to represent the system as wholly their own developed technology going forward, with no acknowledgement of origin. I had spent 20 years building that thing. My name was in the internal documentation hundreds of times. Engineers who trained under me had used it as the basis of their own work. The idea that I would sign a document saying it wasn't mine for any amount of money was something I couldn't make myself do. I told my attorney to counter. We went into mediation 11 days before the scheduled closing. The mediator was a retired federal magistrate. The sessions were held in a conference room in a building downtown that smelled like old carpet and good coffee, which seemed about right for the occasion. The company's side had 3 attorneys. The acquiring company had sent 2 observers. My attorney and I sat across from all of them, and the retired magistrate sat at the head of the table looking at the ceiling a lot. I will spare the procedural detail because it went on for 2 days and most of it was attorneys talking. What matters is what happened at the end of the second day. The deal was structured as follows. My bonus would be paid in full, $90,000, within 72 hours of the mediation agreement. The IP transfer clause would be honored exactly as written, establishing joint ownership. In the final acquisition agreement, the modeling system would be identified as jointly developed technology with attribution to my name and the company's name. The acquiring company would be granted a perpetual, exclusive license to use the system in their operations. In exchange for that license, not a release of my claim, a license, I would receive a licensing fee of $2.4 million, paid over 5 years. My name would be in the contract. That was the part that mattered to me. The CEO's son was not in the room during any of this. I heard later from my former colleague that he had been quietly transitioned out of his corporate development role sometime around the second week of the negotiations. I don't know the details and I didn't ask. The founder, the man who had written that original contract clause back in 2002, had retired to a property outside of Santa Fe. My attorney had located him during discovery and sent him a notice. He called me personally, which I hadn't expected. He said he remembered writing that clause. He said he'd written it because he believed it was fair. He said he was glad to hear it had held up. That call meant more to me than I can easily explain. The closing happened on a Thursday. My wife and I had dinner that night at a place we'd been going to for 15 years, a small Italian restaurant in Montrose where the owner knows us by name. She ordered the salmon. I ordered the lamb. We didn't talk about the deal very much. We talked about our son, who had started his second year of college and called the week before to say he was thinking of switching his major. We talked about a trip we'd been putting off for years, somewhere in Portugal or maybe the Azores. She'd been reading about both. I went back to work the following Monday. Not for the company. I had started a small consulting firm with a former colleague about 3 weeks after the mediation concluded. We had 2 clients within the first month, both of them independent operators in the Permian who had heard, through the quiet channels that these things travel, that I had availability. Within the first year, we had 7. I still run the same model. It's mine to run. There is something I want to say to anyone reading this who has been in a similar position, not the specifics of the legal situation, but the feeling of standing in that parking garage, having just been handed a termination packet, knowing that what you had built was worth far more than they had ever acknowledged to your face. The thing I keep coming back to is this: the original contract clause wasn't an accident. Someone, 20 years ago, sat down and thought about fairness and wrote something that tried to make fairness durable. That document survived 4 ownership changes, 2 PE transactions, and a management team that either didn't read it or hoped I wouldn't. Read your contracts. All of them, especially the old ones. My former colleague still works at the company, now under the acquiring firm's umbrella. We have lunch a few times a year. He says the new management is careful about things that the old management wasn't. I told him, good. The modeling system runs on their servers now. My name is in the documentation. The coffee in Montrose is still the best I've had in Houston. My wife thinks I should find somewhere new after all these years. Maybe she's right, but some things are worth going back to, even when you don't have to. I've thought a lot about what actually happened in that conference room. Not the legal part, but the human part. The CEO's son looked at me across that table and made a calculation. He decided that 26 years of work could be erased with a termination packet and a Friday end date. He decided that because I had never been loud about what I'd built, because I had never walked the halls demanding recognition, that meant I didn't understand my own value. That's the thing about people who inherit power rather than earn it. They tend to mistake quietness for weakness. They see someone who shows up, does the work, goes home, and they think that person is manageable. What they don't see is that the person who has been doing the same difficult thing for 2.5 decades has something they will never have: depth. They know exactly what they built, exactly what it's worth, and exactly what happens when it's gone. My old boss in Midland used to say that the most dangerous person in any room is the one who doesn't need to prove anything. I didn't understand that when I was 31. I think I understand it now. What I keep coming back to is the clause. The founder sat down in 2002 and wrote something fair into a contract, and then he walked away from the company, and that fairness just sat there, buried in a drawer somewhere, for over 20 years. 4 ownership changes, 2 private equity transactions, a whole new management team that never bothered to read the documents they were operating under. And when the moment came, it held. Not because of luck, because someone, at the beginning, had the integrity to write down what was right and make it durable. I think about what would have happened if I had signed that release. $9 million is not nothing. My wife and I sat at that kitchen table until almost midnight, and I will tell you honestly, the number was in the room the whole time. But there was something in those release terms that would have required me to agree, in writing, that the work was not mine, that the thing I had spent more of my life on than almost anything else had no author. That's not a legal technicality. That's a question of who you are. Some things, once you sign them away, don't come back. The outcome wasn't luck either. It came from 26 years of doing the work correctly, from an old man in Oklahoma who believed fairness should be written down, from an attorney who asked exactly the right question in the first 60 seconds, and from my wife, who sat across from me and asked what I actually wanted. Not what I was owed, but what I wanted. That question cut straight through everything. What I want anyone to take from this is simple. Know what you built. Know what your contract says. Especially the old ones. Especially the ones nobody remembers. And when someone tries to tell you that your work doesn't have an author, trust what you know to be true and let the documents speak. The model still runs. My name is still in it. That's enough.